Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking to Lucy Lawless about her documentary film that she directed, Never Look Away. And in starting off and talking about the genesis of how you came to direct this, I love that Joe Duran, who we see in the film, who was a really, really close friend of Margaret Moth, had initially reached out to you with the idea of making a project, and you had come on board as a producer. And it was actually suggested to you that you direct. And once that came to mind and you started to think about the way that you'd already connected to this story, how did that really open up the idea and thinking about how you were actually going to tell this story on screen?
Yes, because it could have been a drama. We could have written a script, but to be honest, that wasn't as exciting to me since that's my meat and drink. That's what I've done for now 38 years, as doing a documentary so I could not only start right away instead of hiring a writer and shaping the story and everything, you start right away. COVID was happening, and I was terrified that we wouldn't get the money in time and that people would die. And indeed, they already had, and time was of the essence. And furthermore, I realized that nobody cared about it like me. I couldn't pay somebody, if I even had the money, to care in the way that I already did. So, yeah, I just went, okay, Margaret. I felt like the power of Margaret compelled me to take it on. And I'm so grateful. She's changed my life. She and Joe have changed my life.
It's amazing. And I also wanted to ask about the experience of going through the archival footage because the way that footage was shot back then was on tape, and a lot of things would get taped over if they weren't used for broadcast. And because Margaret was a camera woman as well, it's not like she was specifically credited in material. And so it must have been
Correct.
a lot more challenging to really dig in and find her specific footage in a lot of ways. And so how did you set about doing that along with Wen Lee, who was your archival producer on this film?
Yes, that was a shock to us to find that crew didn't get credits, and there was no way to cross-reference who did what. So Wen and I went through her passport stamps and her press passes. Plus, anecdotally, we knew she was definitely at certain events, and the rest of the and Wen went to work with both CNN with their archive, limited though it was, because all they had was the finished product, not all the B-roll. And the other thing was a bit of dumb luck. I was just going through YouTube trying to get educated about certain conflicts, and I went, by golly, I think that's Margaret in the background of that shot. So I found out who was the filmmaker. It's this kid in Iran. And I wrote to him. I wrote to him on LinkedIn in English. No luck. So I went and hired somebody from the Citizens Advice Bureau in New Zealand, paid them $60 an hour to track him down. And like 24 hours later, I'd made contact. So we bought his footage, which was tricky because of embargoes, all that sort of thing. But, we had to make sure it was all kosher, as we say, financially dealing and recompensing him for his footage, because there was Margaret in the field, very precious footage. Camera people aren't in front of the camera ever.
No, and I think because of that, it's so interesting in terms of telling her story because, even in the film, a good amount of time passes before we ever hear what she sounds like and we hear her own voice because, to your point, there just wasn't that footage. And, you know,
Mm.
I get the sense, even in the way that people talk about her and the people that were closest to her, that she was still an enigma for everybody. And that's actually half the fun in watching this. And so, what was your experience in directing this film and trying to dive in as deep as you could to the details of who she was and where things stemmed from within her, but also knowing that at the end of the day, she was an enigma to even the people closest?
You're so right. I was getting all these contradictory accounts of these stories, and I couldn't put it together. She was not like anybody I've ever met in my life. And the other thing is that she kept people quite siloed off, and the left hand kind of didn't know what the right hand was doing. So I was getting all these stories going, who is she? So it was really a hunt for who is at the heart, what ties all these satellite qualities together that I'm hearing. And unfortunately, in the end, what I came to realize that what tied it all together was this foundation of emotional neglect in her childhood. And and I wonder if that didn't become her superpower, because it didn't kill her, it made her stronger, that she never in my opinion, maybe never developed the capacity to feel sorry for herself. So when all her beauty and her standing in the community and her speech and her teeth and her tongue and were ripped away from her by a sniper's bullet, she didn't feel sorry for herself, and she survived a catastrophic event that would have killed many a strong young soldier, according to the doctors. Mm.
Absolutely. And also in terms of the people that you're talking to in this film, you're interviewing a lot of people who work in journalism, worked alongside her, work in that space to this day. And it's kind of fascinating to think about the fact that they're so used to being on camera, they're comfortable talking, but they're used to being very objective about stories. And you're essentially asking them to get very personal and to have very specific viewpoints and perspectives. And so, what was that experience in sitting down with people that are very comfortable, but then actually still taking them outside of their comfort zone?
Oh, that is a great question. You know, some people can do it and some people can't, or they won't allow themselves to because they are too much in the corporate mold, maybe, or they just don't want to be um, fully human. You know, if you're being presentational, you're not being fully human. You're not being subject. That's right. They're loath to be subjective, and I'm asking them to be subjective. So there were. I did interview only the people who could give something warm and human that you could relate to, something lean in. Um, Otherwise, they just didn't make the picture, you know.
And you also have a lot of people who had interpersonal relationships with her. And, one of those voices is Jeff Rossi, who was in a relationship with her starting when he was 17 and she was in her 30s. And he talks about the drinking and the drugs and the times that they would have. And, it's all the good and all the bad in every single layer and complexity. And
Mhm.
I've heard you say that it was important to you to front load that at the beginning of the film and not to shy away from showing us right at the beginning all of the breadth of who she was. And when did you realize that that was going to be an important part of telling the story?
I think we cut that sequence together, and because there was a lot of very fascinating stuff about her life in New Zealand before she got there. The sort of the misogyny that was sort of that dominated our culture at the time. Part of the reason she escaped, and in a very novel way too. Slightly criminal. So, I mean, there's fascinating stuff that didn't make the film, but we decided that the strongest place to start the film was with Mystery Woman, shows up in Texas, can remember nothing about her past. And I mean, Mystery Woman, that's interesting. You're already leaning in. And when you hear that she's screwing around with a teenager, you're like, oh, this is not your average biopic. You know, this is not a hagiography. I believe in our flaws. This is what connects us as human beings. It's what interests me. I'm not, I'm interested in subjective accounts. So there's sort of holes in the knitting of the story, you know, where the audience gets to walk in and go, wait a minute, that doesn't jibe with what that person says. Who do I believe? So you get like, for the lovers, for example, you might get Team Jeff or Team Yashinka or Team the family. Who do you believe? Because their accounts are slightly at odds. But that was my experience of interviewing these people.
And when it comes to showing the sequence of events where she was shot and had those horrific injuries, um, I love the choice that you made to create this diorama because obviously there's no actual footage from that moment.
Yeah.
And you've been so specific about the visual way that that's created and the use of colors that you've really kind of seeped into it. What was it that made you realize that that was how you wanted to capture it? Because obviously you had to fill in the imagery somehow.
Yeah, it's really tricky in documentary. Image is everything. You know, you can't just have talking heads um, teaching people a lesson. Nobody wants to sit through that. So it wasn't my idea, actually. Somebody else suggested it because we were going, what do we do? Do we animate it? Do we do recreations? And we were like, oh, that's so trad, that's so boring, and it's expensive and blah, blah. And somebody went, what about diorama? And I went, oh, yeah, because I'm a kid at the 70s and we feel like that's our CGI because we made them. Like everything in this comes out of my childhood. Even the sound design for those sequences is like submarine movies from my childhood to make those nightmarescapes like subliminally stressful for the audience so that you experience something coming and it pays off in an unexpected way. Yeah, every single shot and every single image and sound is designed for the audience's um, it's like for their nervous system to go on a ride. I'm there to entertain you, not teach you a lesson.
And in terms of capturing that in between space as well, I've heard you talk about the use of Buto, which is a Japanese dance form as well. And I was very, very interested in how you came across that. And because I believe it has like specific messaging that almost ties into the narratives of this story as well.
I learned about Buto when I was sitting on top of an oil rig. We had occupied it, me and Greenpeace, for 4 days, and or 3.5. And one of the guys was talking about how these ladies stitch up their lips, and this form of dance came about after the Second World War when the Americans left, and they left all their theatre, their cinemas and theatres. And the Japanese went, what do we do with these spaces? I guess we fill it with our own stories. And what did they have after Hiroshima and Nagasaki? They had shame and the degradation of their bodies and the, the blood and the pus and the degradation, all this stuff. So they turned it into an incredibly powerful and rather ghastly dance form. And only that would suffice to tell the story of Margaret's inner life at the time when she's had basically half her face blown off.
And it's interesting that is the space, after her injuries were sustained, is actually where there is more footage available of her talking and being interviewed and talking about it. And what was the perspective that you wanted to give the audience in really continuing to use that footage? Because it's almost this challenge as well of don't look away from this footage just as much as you're not looking away from the war footage, because it always needs to be the full complexity of humanity.
The number one thing that I hope comes out of this is that truth matters. And there are people like Margaret who repeatedly face death to tell the truth. And in this day and age where we're like, oh, there is no truth, we don't believe anybody, these people you can believe, and we need to adhere to objective fact, whether we like it or not. Facts don't care about our feelings, as Mehdi Hassan said. There are some things that are objectively true. And these people who are out at war, as you and I sit here now, are facing untold dangers to bring us the truth of the non-combatants, the innocent victims of war. And we must not look away.
Absolutely. And I think also there's an interesting interpersonal connectivity that we see amongst all of them, which is that idea of they're the only people that know what they're going through. There's almost this trauma bonding that they all experience. And how did you find that tied together a lot of the relationships that Margaret had with people she worked alongside?
I think there's an incredible fraternity, sort of family of beings who have been through that. It takes all kinds. People think it's a certain type that goes to war. It's not true. There's so many different jobs there, different skills, and it takes a lot of different kinds of people to make a news team at war. But the commonality is this trauma bonding, so that when a conflict kicks off, for example, the day that we interviewed Christiane Amanpour was when Russia invaded Ukraine, and all the journalists were on edge in a way I can't even describe. I guess it's like firefighters, they are, everything in their body and being is impelling them to go towards the danger because their colleagues are there. They must tell a story. It's a vocation, and whether they like it or not, I think they're trauma bonded to the job. And even if they don't like one another, they have a lot of respect for one another.
There's also such a distinction in what made Margaret's footage so unique, and that is the fact that there were so many moments where she was in dangerous situations and could have been injured and killed so many times because she would go towards things and towards the center. And we see that in the footage that you're using. Once you came on board this project, when did you start to realize that was a really unique aspect of, they might be in the middle of gunfire and everybody's ducking for safety, but she's immediately popping up and filming everything?
Yes, people are inclined to say she's an adrenaline junkie. She took outrageous risks. Some people did say that, but Margaret herself felt very strongly that she made a calculated risk. And let's face it, the only time that she suffered an injury was when she was sitting in the back of the van going to work with the rest of the crew. So I can't gainsay her sense of propriety, about the decisions she made. But yes, her ambition was to go in tight. I don't think she thought of herself as being any better than any other crew member. But I'm not making a film about them. I'm making a film about this very fascinating, transgressive being who eventually learned to live for something greater than herself and her own pleasure.
It's also so interesting as well because obviously there's a lot of words and the strength that it took and the determination and words like that come up very frequently. But then there's this whole segment where you have all these moments where people are talking about actually what really made her footage so special and so unique is the empathy. And it was all about building relationships with the people, and there's that great footage that we have of all the kids running around her and they're like, hi, Margaret, hi, Margaret. So you can tell that she's been in the field with them before and built this rapport. When you were interviewing people, when
Yeah.
did you start to realize that empathy and that personal relationship side was such a thread as well?
Well, it's weird because Margaret would, earlier, prior to being shot, earlier in her life, really didn't care for children or, she thought human beings were messed up and there was no hope for any of us. But she discovered, in fact, she didn't want children so much. She went and got her tubes tied, had to go to court to make sure it was done in New Zealand. But she found her children in the theatre of war. She found someone to love more than herself, more than her own safety. And I think in some weird way, that was her redemption.
I also heard that when she was in hospital that she wrote a lot of letters that you had the chance to
Mm,
have access to and to read. And
yeah.
whilst it's not necessarily something that's being read out or displayed on screen, how did that really help you in building the foundation of understanding her or connecting to certain people that you felt would be interesting to talk to?
Well, those letters that you see them, we've animated them, those are exact copies of her notes and her handwriting, and even the paper that they were on at the time. There's a great deal more than that, but we just used what served as counterpoints to the testimony, just so the audience goes, they're saying that, but actually Margaret herself is saying the opposite. So the audience it's a total conversation with the audience of who's telling the truth here, who's the most reliable narrator. And yeah, her notes. She was very concerned about telling the full truth because what was being edited wasn't always the full truth, because the truth is messy. It wasn't only the Serbs who were holding people in camps. It was also going on the Bosnian side, but to a lesser degree. So yeah, she was frustrated, but that was above her pay grade. All she could do was stick to the knitting and do her job. And I guess that's for all of us in crisis. Just do our jobs. Keep going and do your job.
I also love the way that the film opens and ends with these bookends of just capturing that lust for life and that drive of I loved roller skating and jumping out of airplanes and
Yeah.
skydiving and just
Yeah.
the ferocity of relationships with people. And so once you were editing that final sequence, when did you realize that you wanted to tie it back to the way that you introduced us to her at the beginning as well?
Well, the story with Jeff, the young lover, is kind of it's like a coat hanger. It's begins and ends with him with this horrifying um, crisis in the middle of their relationship. And we we experience Margaret through Jeff, the tragedy and the glory and I don't know if you know this, but Jeff actually died at Christmas, right? He didn't get to see the film. He passed away. Um, and he was just such a special man to me. And I feel like the film almost in a way tied up his life, because when I first talked to him, it was all unexamined. It was very raw and still smarting over the loss of Margaret during from her injury in Bosnia in the Sarajevo siege. So it was really interesting to go through his relationship with her, and in the end, he felt a great sense of peace. And 2 months later, he died. So I'm glad I was able to do that for him. In fact, when we went to South by Southwest in his town, Austin, Texas, um, it turned into kind of his memorial. So to see him and Margaret both at the end of the film, young and beautiful, I think was very healing for everybody involved.
I think there's something so beautiful about that because there's also something really poignant in getting to make a film and having someone say, the experience of making this film and talking to you for this film, it feels like it's brought her back to me. And when that was said out loud, how did that feel to suddenly realize that this was you telling a story and introducing audiences, but also that it was really giving something to the people that were able to reshare their memories?
Yeah, I didn't really like that line actually. I was inclined to cut it, but my editor fought me, and I had other fish to fry, to be honest. Other fires to put out, so I let him win that one because I didn't want it to be self-reflective. But I think it put a button on the scene, so I did let that go. But it was, however, true. It turned out to be true that it was a few months later that he died, and I'm glad it was there. Yeah.
Well, I really, really enjoyed the experience of being introduced to her world and her work through this film. So congratulations and
Thank
thank
you.
you so much.
Oh, thanks, Mara. Thanks so much.